So let's now take a look at the basics of a Java program. In order to make any meaningful sentences in any language, doesn't matter if you're talking about English or Spanish, French, German, Italian, doesn't matter. You first need to understand the alphabet, the words, and the grammar of that language. Well, the same is true for a programming language. So we need to understand the special symbols. We need to understand the words of that language. We need to know the syntax rules. So the syntax rules simply tell us what statements are allowed and which ones are not. So these contain rules such as proper punctuation, spacing, where we place specific keywords, same thing like we would do with English words and sentences. We also need to understand the semantic rules, and this determines the meaning of a program. So you could have an instruction that's syntactically correct, but it also has to make sense. Same thing is true in the English language. If you write a sentence, it needs to make sense. So the semantics of a programming language ensures that what we put down does make sense. So, okay, what's the definition of a programming language? Well, it's simply the set of rules, the symbols, and special words that are used to create our programs. Now, when we write our program, not only should the program make sense from the computer perspective, but it needs to make sense to us. And then we can take it one step further. Not only should it make sense to us, but it should make sense to anyone else who reads it. In fact, it's very common when you write a program that someone else could end up looking at your code later on. So without seeing anything else but the code, how are they going to know how your program works? Well, the way we fix that is we include comments in the program. And this provides additional information about the program. There are several examples with this. I mean, most programs will include the authors of the program, the date the program was written, or maybe even the last time it was modified, usually an explanation of the program, and even the meanings of very key statements. And the idea with this is these comments are read by the user. The compiler just simply ignores all the comments. It doesn't read any of it. This is just extra text that we include so that way we understand what's going on in the program. And you might think there isn't much point to this, but it is extremely important to include comments in your program, because let's say you write up a program and then you don't touch it for 6 months and then you take a look at it again. Are you going to understand exactly everything that was in there? For a small program, you probably would, but for a larger program, I doubt it. I'll give you a personal example for myself. I wrote this big, long program many, many years ago, and it used all sorts of complex structures, and I got everything worked out. It's just fine. And then about a year later, I had to make changes to it, and I started looking at it again, and I didn't have that much comments in there. And I had to try to remind myself, okay, what does this line do? What does this line do? What does this line do? And I spent a lot of time trying to refresh my memory. It would have saved a lot of trouble had I just included comments saying what those lines do. So it's very important to get in the habit now of just writing a couple of comments in different parts of your program just so you can understand what's going on, but also making sure that other people understand what's going on. Not necessarily in this course, but down the road, you may find yourself working on group projects where you're in charge of one part of the code and someone else has to take a look at it. If you don't include any comments in there, the other person's not going to have a great idea of what your program is doing. So just the bottom line is get into the habit of writing comments. So if we're going to start adding comments to our code, it's probably a good idea to know how to do it. Well, in Java, there are two different types of comments. We have single line comments and multiple line comments. Single line comments begin with 2 slashes, and then anything that is placed afterwards would be part of the comment. So after the 2 slashes, you can put anything you want, because remember, the compiler does not read the comments. So it's not going to check if any syntax rules are correct with the comments. So the whole point here is you do your 2 slashes, and you got to put them on the same line, and then everything afterwards would be treated as a comment. So just to give an example here, if I have the line system.out.println and then hi, everything up to that semicolon the compiler would read as you print out the word hi. And then the two slashes indicate that everything afterwards would be a comment. So the line that says this is a comment, Java isn't going to do anything with that. It doesn't even read that line. Now, multiple line comments, the idea with this is we enclose them in a slash star and then another star slash. So everything between them would be considered comments. And once again, the compiler would just ignore everything that's between the stars in this case. And the benefit about this is that we can write comments on multiple lines. So you may need more than just one line to explain some particular part of your program. So you can do a slash star, and then you can write on one line, and if you need more space, you can just keep tacking on multiple lines. And the comment does not end until we do a star slash. Some programs, if you look them up, you might see that each line that's a comment begins with a star. That's not required at all. It's just a way to help the reader understand that that's still part of the comment. So whether you include that or not is completely up to you. And of course, there are special symbols that we need to keep in mind when writing our programs. So for instance, if we wanted to do any math operations, well, we can use the common math symbols. So we can do plus for addition, a dash for minus, a star for multiplication, and a slash for division. We have punctuation marks, so we can use periods, semicolons, question marks, commas. There are additional marks as well. We can use comparisons, so we have symbols to deal with those. So we can do the less than or equal to. We can do an exclamation point equal to represent not equals, two equal sign to represent equality, and then a greater than symbol and then an equal sign to check greater than or equal to. And there are several other symbols we can use for comparisons. All programming languages also include very specific reserved words. Sometimes these are also called keywords. These words are always lowercase and they cannot be redefined. So they cannot be used for anything other than its intended purpose. So let me give you a couple examples. We have int, float, double, char. Sometimes it's also called char. People interchange those two words. Void, public, static, and this is just a small set of keywords. And we'll be going over the meanings behind these keywords later on. But the point here is that our language includes very specific words that we can use in our programs, and we cannot redefine it to do anything other than what it's supposed to do. And the last thing we'll talk about are identifiers. So an identifier is just simply the name of something in our program. So this could be a variable, it could be a constant, it could be a method. So all these are just different names that appear in our programs. Now, if we're going to use an identifier, we need to know what can be part of the identifier. So this can consist of letters, numbers, an underscore, and even the dollar sign. But there are rules to use the identifier. So each identifier must begin with a letter, an underscore, or a dollar sign. So the bottom line is we cannot have it start with a number. Otherwise, Java is not going to recognize whether it's an identifier or it's actually a number. Now, some identifiers are predefined. So just to give you some examples, we'd have print, printline, and printf. We've seen a couple of examples of these already in some sample programs. But all these are identifiers. They're not keywords. They're just the names of methods that have some intended purpose. And we'll be looking at several different examples of identifiers later on.